Pastor Drew, another sermon in the Mark series on the miracles. Getting 2 miracles this week, so maybe your time was a little bit more short than you were used to, but had you had more time, was there a thread in particular that you would have pulled on?
Yeah, couple things I would maybe mention. I've preached this passage before as a whole passage, I think. It's the passage on Jairus and his daughter is gravely ill on the doorstep of death, and he comes and seeks out Jesus. And then on their way back to the house, Jesus is interrupted by this interaction with a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. And when I've preached it in the past, I have kind of focused more on the bleeding woman, and maybe a little bit less on the Jairus story, even though the two go together. You know, it's a picture within a picture. So for this sermon, I focused a bit more on Jairus and the way that Jesus was growing his faith through this experience. And but I guess some of the things that I was thinking about in the aftermath of the sermon had more to do with the interaction with the woman. And the first one actually was somebody from the congregation that mentioned to me, and I don't know that I've ever thought about it specifically before, but Jesus throughout the Gospels never has to go through that 7-day ritual of cleansing after interacting with someone who's considered unclean. And she mentioned to me, do you think that Jesus had to heal a leper, let's say, or this woman who had been bleeding, these two unclean types of people? Do you think that Jesus had to heal them? Otherwise, he'd have to kind of step away from his ministry for 7 days and do this ritual cleansing. And would that contaminate him in some way? And that was just a fascinating thing for someone to bring up, you know?
I've got an opinion on this, actually.
Yeah, share.
From my Leviticus study. So in the categories that the Israelites could be found in Leviticus, you could be holy, you could be common,
okay,
or clean, or you could be unclean. And God is only holy, holy, holy.
Right. Okay.
So actually in Leviticus, Leviticus talks about how holiness and uncleanness is transferable. Mm-hmm. The direction it normally goes for human beings is towards uncleanness.
Right.
Mm-hmm. You've got to work to keep yourself clean.
But you'll drift toward defilement.
But very easily walking over a grave, touching a bug, interacting with someone who's sick, very easily you could be uncleanness could be transferred to you.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, the careful thing here is you don't want to treat it like a magic talisman or something. Mm-hmm. Like if we just get a piece of the apostles' memorabilia and keep it in our church, then we can make people holy by just touching them. That's not what we're saying. But Jesus' nature is such that he can only be holy.
Yeah.
And so anytime he comes into contact with uncleanness, he transfers his holiness.
He's going to pull the unclean in the different direction. That's kind of the way that I was thinking about it too, and that's kind of the way that I answered. Yeah, and also the fact that if Jesus, there was a situation where Jesus, let's say, had to go through a ritual cleansing, then all of a sudden he's a lamb with blemish, right?
Well, that happens at the baptism.
Right.
So, I mean, we've talked about this, even on a longer ending, I think. What's Jesus doing receiving baptism for the forgiveness of sins?
He doesn't need it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Except to liken himself to man, so that the writer of Hebrews can say, like us in every way.
Yeah. The other thing has more to do with application, and this is just something I was thinking about, because I started a book at the end of last week entitled The Mindful Christian, and just talks about kind of bringing yourself back to a place where you're listening to God's leading in your life, trying to slow things down, be present in the moment. And so I started reading this book, and then I kind of had this sermon pretty well set. But this story is kind of a perfect example of how tuned in Jesus was to his Father's will. So just in terms of Jesus kind of modeling for us, being sensitive to his Father's will, and the people that he brings into our lives on a daily basis that perhaps he has intentions for and that he wants to work through us. I think that this story is a good example of how Jesus did that perfectly. And so God's going to give you enough time over the course of a day to do what he has given you to do, for you to kind of accomplish his will in the day. Now, we can't do that perfectly, but he's going to give you enough time in the day. And so it's just kind of a gut check moment and a heart check moment. Like, we rush from one thing to another, and we're sometimes so busy thinking about the next thing that we're not present in the moment. And I just wonder how many opportunities I miss,
Sure.
like the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years that needed an interaction with Jesus, right? And so by way of application, that's maybe a thread I would have pulled on a little bit more.
You're right that the bulk of the sermon was about how, maybe Jairus is like, let's hurry up.
Right.
And Jesus is in no rush. I remember that being a big emphasis of Pastor Ben Johnson when he was here as my youth leader, just saying, I'm going to be late to stuff because when people need help, I'm going to help them. And just that was so simple and yet so countercultural.
Sure.
In this hustle culture.
Yep.
And I'm someone, I love to be on time and I hate when people are late. And so just that idea, if someone needs help, I'm going to help them even if it makes me late for the next thing.
Yep.
And that's so obvious.
Sure.
But so hard for me to even hear. And Jesus models that well. There are things that God's going to give me to do today, and I'm going to do them as they come.
Right.
And I think there's a sense of trust that we have to have that God is putting those things in the right time and place. But.
Yeah. And just with regard to Jesus in general, if I'm gonna fall in one ditch or another, it's going to be in the ditch of overemphasizing his divinity. I mean, this is Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And so, I believe that Jesus is God, and my mind is going to emphasize that more. But, when you look at the way that Jesus lived his life as an example, you can't only do that because you can fall off another ditch that way. It's just that, maybe my tendency isn't to think that way. And maybe I should look at Jesus' life as more of a, if this is who I'm becoming in Christ, I need to pay a little bit closer attention, not necessarily to the miracles, but just the attitude and the posture that Jesus had with regard to dealing with people and dealing with situations. Because let's face it, Jesus had plenty of situations where I would be extremely frustrated within 3 seconds, but he handled it with grace, and there's something to be learned from that.
Right. There's some popular studies today about how Jesus did hospitality.
Yeah.
We reference all the time. You got one coming up this week Sunday about Jesus trying to get to a quiet place to meditate and pray. I mean, those habits are worth $1 billion as we pattern our lives after Jesus.